we're ready to go. Um, my first question is, you argue that all AI inventions should start with ethics first. What do you mean by that?
So, first and foremost, when we talk about AI, I see not kind of an objective category of artificial intelligence. I see a set of techniques and technologies that are generated by human interests and motivations, that are shaped by human decisions, that are designed, developed, and deployed in accordance with human choices. And so when I think of AI, I'm thinking about those systems and practices. And because these are social and human products, for me, they are sort of bound by moral and ethical constraints. And we think of these even as sociotechnical systems. And so as sociotechnical systems, we first and foremost need to think of these as bearing a responsibility for their impacts on other people in society, on impacted communities, etc. And so for me, the starting from like an ethical point of view is very sort of natural if we see these technologies as products of human choices.
And one aspect of your worldview is considering the first order, second order, third order effects on humans themselves by building a product like AI. What are those effects? What are you most afraid of, and what are you considering?
Well, I think we need to look at the impacts of AI along different planes. So first, we can think of the impacts of the design, development, and deployment of AI systems on individuals. So for instance, the ways in which our relationships to technology might shape us in negative ways. So one example might be we see today increasing use of AI as companions and even AI as therapists. And one potential externality there is that there is a misconception that when one is interacting with a technology, one is actually interacting with an empathetic being, some type of other social partner, whereas these are statistical systems. And there can be a real effect on an individual's sense of physical, mental, and moral integrity, on their sense of dignity in being an interactor with other human beings, and yet being displaced by interacting with the technology that kind of is portraying itself as a human-like entity. And so at that level, at the individual level, there's a host of different potential negative effects, that being one of them. Then we can think of impacts at the social or social relational level. So one example here of a potential negative impact is you have increasing use of AI systems for live facial recognition or other types of biometric surveillance technologies. And if we live in a world where the environment that we're traveling around in is an environment that's full of sensors that are able to surveil us and surveil who we're interacting with at any given time, this can have a chilling effect on our capacity to move around in the world and have fully formed social relationships that we feel are our own and that aren't kind of under the watchful eye of some type of technological intervention or power. And so that you have at that level, at that social level, also, a series of other potential negative impacts. At that level too, we can think of what we call the integrity of the information ecosystem. So past couple of years, we've seen an explosion of generative AI producing all of this text and image and video content out there in our information ecosystem. And so in a world where you've got this kind of hosepipe of synthetic information being basically released into our information ecosystem, we can envision a world in which there may be an undermining of trust in the validity, the accuracy of the sources of information that we're confronting online or in our everyday lives, right? Because we simply can't tell at some point when this information becomes indiscernible, if you will, from human produced content. And there you have, if you don't have a kind of trustworthy information ecosystem, it can really undermine democratic forms of life. It can undermine our ability to make informed choices as a consumer, as a citizen, right, in our political life. And so we need to think about, right, that level of our societal and interpersonal relationships and how these technologies, when used at scale, can affect those things. And then we can also think of it at the kind of biospheric or planetary level impacts. And we already see there is tremendous impacts of the information processing that's needed in order to run these generative AI and large language model systems. So when we do a Google search now, right, you've got the Gemini or whatever, large language model they're using on Google now to have be the AI generated kind of response. And that's using energy in ways that may well already be having negative impacts on the climate. And one can just kind of see the direction of travel now as there is a real push to build thousands of data centers right now so that all of this information processing is facilitated by our information processing capacity. And it raises real issues about impacts on biosphere. Like how will the sustainability of our planet be impacted by this kind of hyperscaling of the use of AI? And this is really reflected in the push to build data centers. So when you ask me what are the kind of impacts, like I think we need to think about us as individuals, we need to think about our relationships in society, and we need to think about our impacts on the planet. All of those are equally important.
Yeah, so just to summarize, when it comes to the individual level, you're talking about how us being convinced that these LLMs are sentient like we are, have the capacity for empathy, can maybe trick us into forming relationships that are harmful to us. And then the second level, you mentioned something about the chilling effect on our ability to relate to others as a result of that personal relationship with LLMs. Then you talked about effects on the ecosystem. And so does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, these are examples. I mean, some of the other ones that I would highlight are we think about fairness and equity and the way in which AI is largely generated by machine learning, which is basically statistical, identifying patterns in data distributions through statistical inference. What that means is these systems are driven by data. They're driven by what exists out there already in the world. And what exists out there already in the world are patterns of inequity, are patterns of discrimination that get, if you will, baked into data sets and baked into the way that certain groups are overrepresented in data sets and certain groups are underrepresented in data sets. And so what that all leads us to really thinking about are, for instance, with generative AI and large language models, what are the ultimate equity and discrimination implications of the hyperscaled use of these systems, for instance, for underrepresented languages and underrepresented cultures, right? Are the outputs of these systems sufficiently accommodating those specific cultural contexts in the generated output? It's likely that they're not. We know that there's a lot of stereotyping in these systems. We know that these systems don't function as well for cultures that are less represented and languages that are less represented in their data sets. And so we have a whole host of fairness and equity issues that are really important there as well. So in any case, we can sit here and I can highlight many more, potential externalities, but I would prioritize the issues of fairness and discrimination as well.
You mentioned that AI is essentially statistical predictors and splicers and token readers. I want to definitely get back to that, but we've talked about some problems that might arise from LLMs and AI. What are some things you worked on? I know we can probably talk about your process-based governance framework, for example, and some of the work you've done for public policy in the UK. But yeah, wherever you'd like to start.
So so my role, so I'm the Director of Ethics and Responsible Innovation Research at the Alan Turing Institute, which is Great Britain's National Data Science and AI Institute. And as part of that role, on the one hand, we serve an advisory function for public sector bodies and public organizations, nonprofit organizations, international organizations. And as part of that, over the last, been there about 6.5, almost 7 years now, I've written the UK's official public sector guidance on AI ethics and safety. I've written or been the principal author of the UK's National AI Explainability Guidance. And I've also, my team and myself have written the Council of Europe's Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law Impact Assessment for AI Systems, which is part of the Council of Europe has just ratified a convention to align the design, development, employment of AI with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So we wrote the kind of impact assessment instrument for that.
How do they feel about an American doing all this? No, I'm just joking.
Well, no, it's a really good question.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in certain venues it matters more than in others.
Oh, interesting.
And I think it's funny because oftentimes in the UK context, they can't tell if you're Canadian or American. So right. There's a lot of Canadian because of the Commonwealth who work here. And so it's not usually tabled as an issue. But I think in the Council of Europe context, I'm an expert and, I'm a non-political person. I'm not a non-policy person. We go and we are writing governance instruments that are informed by our particular expertise in thinking about AI as a kind of product of human, as I was saying, as a sociotechnical product. And
sure.
So the governance frameworks we write are coming from that expertise. And so the American provenance of my intellectual background isn't made a big issue. But I would say in all of those different more sort of advisory or practical endeavors, there's a kind of common thread, which is to really prioritize practice in understanding issues of ethics and governance, right? So for many years, I think, say, the early 2000s and 2010s, when we looked at, data ethics frameworks, digital ethics frameworks, and then AI ethics frameworks, it was really principles oriented. And so there were 5 or 10 principles that were considered important: fairness, transparency, accountability, these kind of really kind of important normative concepts. But there wasn't a focus on how to operationalize those principles in practice. And I think one of the contributions of the pieces that I mentioned to you has been that putting the principles into practice has been the priority, and the process-based governance framework is just about that. So for instance, when we think of the value or principle of sustainability, sort of social sustainability, that a system won't ultimately be so harmful that it won't be sustainable in society and be bad for the planet, etc. Sustainability is operationalized in those frameworks through ex ante impact assessment, where before the system is ever brought into the world, you go through a process of assessing the risks, thinking about impacts on individuals and society and planet, and then using that kind of process of analysis to shape the limitations of what you're doing and to govern, how you're going to set parameters and boundaries around the technological practice. That's just one example, but we can also think of fairness, right? So fairness is a difficult concept. It means many things to many different people. From a governance perspective, what we've done, for instance, in the UK's national guidance, we focus on equality law. We focus on the different types of discrimination and discriminatory harassment, and unpack how at different points in the design, development, and deployment lifecycle, there can be biases, unfair biases, which come out, which will then tend to have discriminatory impact. And so we have a bias self-assessment, for instance, an end-to-end bias self-assessment that operationalizes how do you prevent a violation of non-discrimination law and equality law. And so there's a very concrete way that we're translating the principle of fairness into practice. And so all of the different dimensions that applies for explainability, it applies for, accountability and transparency. The process-based governance framework is just to show a path from the normative concept to the actual making it manifest in the way that you're designing, deploying, and developing technology.
And definitely want to talk about auditability here in a second, but I'd like for you to maybe give us a concrete example of how your framework would help understand how fairness would be measured for, let's say, an AI model.
Right. So there are different ways that one can, if we just take technical fairness, right? Think about allocation of errors or distribution of outcomes, right? So these are systems that are a lot of these systems, for instance, the predictive risk modeling, they'll have different error rates, and those error rates that the systems have can be have different consequences for different social groups, right? And so there are various fairness metrics that are chosen to govern the allocation of decisions that are for different social groups. And so one very concrete way that one can operationalize a fairness concept is, well, let's make explicit what the choice of fairness metrics has been in the allocation of outcomes or errors in the system. Make that explicit. Make explicit the rationale behind why you've chosen one particular fairness metric over another particular fairness metric, and then make that accessible and public to people who are going to be impacted by your system, right? So that's a very concrete procedural way of making explicit choices that have fairness impacts. And the other very concrete example would be show me, display, and give me assurance that you have gone through a diligent bias mitigation process. And I'll give you just one example. So when a system when you're measuring the performance of a system, you can measure the performance of a system irrespective of differential performance for different social groups. So this system has a kind of 90% accuracy rate, just as a hypothetical. That same system, right, might have a 90% overall accuracy rate, but actually, if you look at the accuracy for different social groups, it might be 99% accurate for one social demographic group and 50 or 40% accurate for another social and demographic group that's less represented, right, in the distribution. And
is that purely because there's a smaller sample size of the data, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, I mean the differential performance may well be generated by the representational imbalances.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking of how the bias is cropping up, if you have a system and you're telling the public, my system is 90% accurate, right? And yet, for some users, it's 40% accurate, and for other users, it's 99% accurate. They're users who are getting discriminated against, right? And others that are perhaps of a privileged group that are benefiting from it, right? And so we call this aggregation bias. And so if you're doing bias self-assessment, when you get to that point and you're looking at your performance metrics, right, before the system's ever out there in the world, then you ask the question: Have I sufficiently looked at the performance for different social groups so that I can understand if there's differential performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just a one way that an understanding of aggregation bias can really manifest in better practice in building a system.
And it's called aggregation bias because you're not segmenting your population and looking
Yeah.
at, okay.
Yeah, it's just you're aggregating without looking at the differential, the segmented performance.
Very cool. So I also wanted to talk about how you've talked about ascribing responsibility of AI outcomes. Why is that important to you?
So, I mean, one way to look at it is there's something unique about artificial intelligence as a technology in the world. And that's that whereas other technologies are sort of always being used through human choices, and so you can always place the onus of responsibility on a human who's making a choice. What AI does is it serves surrogate cognitive functions in the world. So it's standing in, if you will, for thinking humans, right? So like if you use a predictive risk model and rely on a predictive risk model, the output of the system becomes a kind of decision point in the world. And that decision point in and of itself doesn't bear responsibility for its output because it's just a statistical system being run on a von Neumann architecture. It's just kind of a technical operation on hardware, and that causes, if you will, what we might think of as an accountability gap, right? So if one can extrapolate and envision a world in which you've got a lot of AI systems serving surrogate cognitive functions in the world without at the same time bearing the legal moral responsibility for those outputs, then at that point when something goes wrong, how do we understand who to hold responsible for that having gone wrong? And so thinking about a kind of end-to-end chain of human responsibility so that the outcomes or outputs of the use of the system can be, tracked back to a legal or morally responsible individual, it becomes a priority in a way, because to live in a world in which we have multiplying accountability gaps,
right?
Where you can just say, well, the computer did it, the AI system did it, without having a real human sight of legal and ethical responsibility. I don't think any one of us would like to live in that world. And just to say, I mean, we're going through a time now where you've got a rapid expansion of the use of things like agentic AI, right? Where you've got these systems that are really actually operating actively in the world to sort of stand in for you or me doing certain activities or tasks. We need to have ways to put the onus of responsibility in the right place, so that when there are externalities, when there are things that go wrong, we can hold people responsible for it.
How do you deal with the fact that these models are infamously stochastic, or that there's randomness to it that perhaps may not be ascribable to one person or even a aspect of the LLM itself, because it's kind of a black box as far as we can still tell?
Right. So, these are non-deterministic systems, as you suggest, right? So, you have a system and, the output for the same inputs, right, can be different in different times, just in virtue of that non-deterministic character. And these systems, if we're thinking about the more sort of complex systems, as you suggest, the more black box systems, these are going to be operating in open, dynamic environments without us being able to really sort of point to the elements of the machinery of the algorithmic system, right, that generated the rationale behind the output, that generated the output. And this raises all sorts of issues, as you suggest, about how do you even figure out what went wrong, like and in a way, for me, that just puts a punctuation point on the importance of the human decision making, because when humans design a technology that we are putting out in the world. So someone designs an agentic system that's a black box system and decides that system will be used for X purpose in the world. Those are all decisions that have to bear in mind these elements of uncertainty, these elements of not really being able to sufficiently potentially control the behavior of the system. And in a sense, it's that site of consideration, decision making that's happening at the design and development stage that matters, right? Because the person who, just like in any other product, right? If you're putting a product out in the world, right, you're gonna kind of fall responsible if things go wrong, right? If you haven't done the right type of diligence in assessing risks. And so I do think that we are in a brave new world when it comes to the use of these really complex systems that we don't fully grasp, and that that will make unpredictable, that will generate unpredictable outcomes and outputs. But for me, that doesn't mean that a human isn't responsible for putting that system out into the world.
So do you think on average is it a net positive or net negative that we have AI?
So I think we have to be really careful about how we say AI.
That's fair.
I think there are tremendous opportunities to use machine learning systems, AI technologies, to advance health and biomedical research, to do amazing things in science. So discovering new materials, discovering new drugs, discovering many different elements that would otherwise not have been accessible to us in virtue of our own limitations. These systems are remarkable insofar as they can take very high dimensional, very extensive and complex data sets and find patterns that are not accessible to our human style semantic thinking. And for that reason, right, we have things like AlphaFold, and which is right this kind of this system which discovers the structure of proteins. And you can think of all of the really important consequences in science of being able to sort of discover these patterns, right, in the material world. And so I think for me, that element of having this new tool for invention and for discovery is a game changer ultimately, if it's used for the public interest, if it's used for the public good. And so I do think that there's a net positive to that. But at the same time, I worry about the broader direction of travel of the innovation and research ecosystem in AI, because from where I sit, you look at the past few years, and what do we see? We see a kind of rapid industrial revolution in AI, where you've got very, very large tech companies that are in a sense controlling, right, a lot of the resources, the infrastructure needed to advance the larger scale systems. And you've got an increasing concentration of technological and economic power in these companies, and there now is increasingly an alignment of geopolitical interests with the geoeconomic interests that come out of the tech companies. So what concerns me is you have an opportunity now to really have scientific advances that would benefit the biosphere. We didn't even talk about the capacity to address biodiversity drain and climate change, and there are many different instances where one can think about using machine learning and AI systems to help with those areas. But generally speaking, that's not where we're headed. We're headed to a world where you you have a real explosion of commercial interests without sufficient considerations of the social impacts. For instance, as a teacher right now, I mean, I'm sure you in your undergraduate life have experienced a difference today with access to ChatGPT or X large language model, and how that could be used, right, to help you with essay writing, or to shape the way that you're approaching your courses and your classes. I see, as a professor, I see there's a real sea change going on. There's competition among students that's forcing even those who wouldn't want to use these systems, right? To use them in order to not fall behind others they know are using these systems, right? And what's concerning to me is that had sufficient forethought been put into how these systems are being operationalized in the world, there might have been an opportunity to avoid what is increasingly becoming clear as potentially leading to cognitive atrophy, de-skilling of critical thinking, many of these attributes that in the academy and you coming up through college that were supposed to be part of your development as a student. These are increasingly being challenged. I mean, I was just reading a pretty disturbing paper, right, on, it looked at how the brain activity patterns of students that were relying on a large language model and that were relying on a search like Google search and that were relying on just themselves. Like, what are the different brain patterns? What are the different retention patterns in those students? And they found a significant difference between those who were, relying on the large language model and those who were writing the essay themselves, right? In the college context. So I'm using this as an example, right? To illustrate that the rapid expansion of these technologies now haven't necessarily accorded with concerns for social good, social well-being, and that's concerning to me. And so when we think of, like, the question, is AI a net positive? It could be, but I just at this point I feel like we are experiencing real challenges in having sufficient kind of governance controls put on these systems so they don't have multiplying externalities. And I've just used one tiny example of hundreds of examples that we can think of. I mean, one other one that I'll quickly mention is creative industries. We've just completed a study of the impacts of the use of generative AI on the creative industries in the UK. And what's become apparent is the sustainability of being an artist or a creative worker as we move into a world in which the priorities of efficiency and productivity lead companies to automate a lot of the functions that were being served by designers and by different types of artists, by voice artists, right, doing voiceover work for commercials. Like the cost savings now as a priority mean that there will be fewer artists and creative workers who are able to live in the world. And have we really thought about the consequences of that? Art plays a deep social function. And in a world where we've just kind of automated, the production of many aspects of art in both performance art and in video and visual art, what type of world will we ultimately live in? I mean, this is just generating statistical patterns that have already been part of the archive of artists' work that have been largely appropriated without respect of intellectual property. And I mean, we live in a world in which this is actually happening. Can you imagine a world, and we call it an enshittified world, where the value of art is diminished because there's not a sustainable profession where artists can use their imagination to create novelty in the world. I mean, this is not a world that I think would be as rich and fulfilling for many people.
So I do want to get through some of the pushbacks and the critics against AI safety folks like yourself.
Yeah.
For one, the big claim that, say, accelerationists make is that the more regulations you impose on AI and technology, the slower the progress will be, and the more likely it is that you're gonna reduce the odds of producing things that are both life-changing in a good way and life-saving. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think there's been a kind of tendency, and I think it's ideological, to equate regulation with the stifling of innovation.
Okay.
Good, well-governed data science, good, well-governed AI technology is technology that's not only performant, so that functions well and is more useful in the world. It is technology that will do better for those who produce it, and for those who use it, and those who are impacted by it. And so, good regulation and good governance can only advance technology. We've seen, I think, in the history of data-driven systems, that a lack of sufficient governance and a lack of regulation can lead us, down into the ditches, and can lead, I think, those who are competing in the kind of innovation ecosystem to races for the bottom, right? Races to the bottom. And so we do need, I think, ways to generate justified public trust in the technology. And ways to generate justified public trust in the technology come from good governance. They come from the assurance of the technology. And there's a scope of governance and regulatory intervention too. I mean, a range of options. And they don't always need to involve a kind of heavy hand of, right, hard statutory intervention. There's a range of ways that we approach governance.
Fair enough. But I guess another pushback they would have is, you mentioned good governance of AI leads to positive results. And it's kind of hard to ensure good governance, especially when governments in the past have tended to be corrupt as power centralizes and consolidates itself. So a common critique is that if you're going to base how you regulate AI on a centralized model, it's more likely to lead to biases, to be stagnant, to be based on, let's call it, the ethics of the times, rather than something that's progressing and developing. And then I guess the second leg of that argument would be, humans are fallible generally. We are plagued with cognitive biases. For example, things like the halo effect, where you are more likely to hire someone just because they're more attractive, even if the other person is of equal competence, and stuff like this. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, on the centralization idea, so I don't think we need to equate good governance and regulation with central government authority. Mm-hmm. What we see now, especially as artificial intelligence technologies have become more globalized or global, right? I mean, these larger tech companies, these are transnational companies, and the issues that are raised by AI, as all of these kind of global AI summits that have happened the past couple of years have shown, these are global issues, right? And so the movement of the international AI standards and governance community, for instance, is a movement towards thinking about regulation and governance transversely, so not centralized, but thinking about how can we come to some type of community of collaborating parties. It's in a sense decentered, in the sense of having an inclusive set of voices from different parts of the world, and thinking about what are the sort of non-exchangeable elements of good governance for these technologies, right? So, for instance, thinking about non-discrimination, thinking about a rights-based approach to making sure that these systems don't, injure, someone's mental, moral integrity, etc. There are increasingly international, global, and intercultural perspectives on building out governance and standards for AI technology. And I think the fear of corrupt centralized government, again, is kind of a caricature.
Sure.
When you think about the kind of complexity of innovation and research ecosystems in AI. And it is absolutely true that there are all sorts of ways that, for instance, when you leave regulation to national governments, for instance, there's regulatory capture, right? So in AI in particular, in any advanced technologies, you've got knowledge asymmetries between the companies that are building the systems and the regulators who have to regulate the systems, and the governments that have to regulate the systems. In other words, there's a monopoly, right, on the advanced knowledge in the companies. And so that knowledge asymmetry makes it much harder for regulation. And so what you have oftentimes in a national context, you've got the companies that are populating the standards bodies that are influencing the regulators, because there's a deference to those companies because they have the knowledge, right? And so the question then becomes, do you want a company who has interests, right, to shape regulation and governance in a particular way,
Sure,
with their hands on the wheel, right? And so there is, just to say, not to say corruption, but there is a kind of self-interested shaping of regulatory ecosystems there. But I don't think it's kind of coming from, corrupt centralized governments in that sense.
And then kind of going back to an earlier point, I like to think that if algorithms and AI is done right, it can be even more unbiased than humans. But doing it right is hard, and this is what we're talking about. And I like to think of this example that Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow gives. He, I think, worked in the Israeli government for a little bit, or did some work there. And at first, they were hiring people based on, I don't know if you've ever watched Moneyball. There's that one scene where Brad Pitt is sitting with the recruiters, and they're like, he looks good. We'll take him on, or he's got a pretty girlfriend, or these very superficial, biased metrics of deciding who we should hire or who we should pick and decide. Mm-hmm. And then when you bring in an algorithm that focuses only on attributes that are specific to your goal, everything else falls apart. And so I like to think that if an algorithm is done right, if it's pure, insofar as it is solely looking at certain attributes, certain characteristics of the people you're making decisions about, we minimize the noise, and we have a way of ensuring that it is debiased. It can do better than humans at decision making. Mm-hmm. Is that something you see as a guiding light, or is that something you disagree with? Or
so I think I would put it just slightly differently and just say that the focus on fairness, mm-hmm. and the focus on non-discrimination that comes from designing technologies that are producing outputs and at decision points that have to do with being more equitable or being fair, like in a hiring process or in a loan decision process. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good thing, because it's forcing us to be more deliberate, right, about what are the characteristics that really matter in this decision making, and are these particular features or characteristics being properly reflected in the output, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a real strength to that, because it's not that the technology is fair and debiased as such. It's that the whole practice of hiring in that particular situation is improved in that we're thinking more about the fairness of that process.
Okay. And
the outcome ultimately for me is not that the systems then are just kind of, generating the equitable output. It's that the human that's using the system is being informed in a certain way with this kind of set of structured priorities that are helping them avoid the cognitive biases, sure, in the decision-making process. And so I do think, I'll just quickly say, over the past, 5 to 10 years, we've seen an evolution in thinking about algorithmic fairness, where really, like, it started as just thinking about it very technically.
Yeah.
You would think about allocation of errors, as we were talking about before, distribution of outputs, outcomes. And that was it. You would think about what is the technical machinery of changing, this feature or that feature or this distribution, pre-processing, in processing, post-processing. It was very technical. But over time, I think the conversation has evolved. So we think now about fairness in deciding on what the target variable should be. So like this human decision about, how is it, what are we trying to measure?
Sure.
And what are the proxies through which we're measuring the output that the outcome that we want to measure? And those are very kind of human decisions. And there are real fairness impacts to how you're defining your target variable. And it's evolved so that we're now focusing more and more on problem formulation and the equity of, we talked about aggregation biases and like the whole process of understanding fairness and discrimination across the whole life cycle has, I think, potentially improved our own reflective ability to think about these things. And so I think the evolution towards a deeper and richer notion of fairness that includes, discrimination, direct and indirect discrimination, and transformative justice, and even thinking about other elements of discriminatory harassment that you would think about, and equity in general. All of that development has made the use of the technology potentially advance our own kind of approach to fairness, equity, and non-discrimination. And so for me, that's the good outcome, is that, in being so careful now with the technology, we're actually improving our own practice.
Oh man, I wish we could talk about this more, but I'm going to ask you my last question. What's one thing you want future generations, let's assume somehow in the future we're going to have AGI, advanced AI, maybe even sentient AI. What do you want future generations to know about AI and the human experience?
So this is opening a can of worms.
Oh,
because actually, I think, for me, and maybe this is a nice way to end.
Mm-hmm.
For me, we have to be careful when we talk about artificial general intelligence. I don't think that, or at least I haven't yet seen a coherent definition that's been operationalized with performance, metrics about what general intelligence, might look like in a statistical system. We know, I think, increasingly by the interventions of cognitive scientists and neuroscientists and linguistic anthropologists and evolutionary biologists and many other sort of disciplinary expertise, persons with disciplinary expertise, their interventions in thinking about, these claims about AGI, are they really reflecting, a rich and interdisciplinary view of intelligence, which has informed the social and the natural sciences for generations? Is that really informing the way the word AGI is used, or super intelligence?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think there's a lot more hype in the use of those terms than there is science. And do I think that these statistical systems will be able to increasingly simulate what appears to us as intelligent behavior? Sure. I mean, I think they're already very well simulating many aspects of it. But do I think that they have the full, rich array of embodied, enacted, distributed social dimensions of intelligence? They don't. And I think it's a much longer conversation, but if I'm thinking into sort of talking to generations in the future about this, I would say you need to step back and really just look at the science of what's happening in these systems and draw on the rich body of human understanding to critically question what's actually happening in the technology and what's happening in our interaction, in our exchange of ideas, in the sharing of our collective intelligence in our conversation. That's what's going on in these token predictor systems, even if they're multimodal, even if they're drawing on, video and voice and, these other, they're text-based systems that are also, in this very rich world of experience. And I would say ultimately, this is the site that we need to continually have critical reflection, because ultimately it is, I think, a very basic element of our humanity and our biospheric identity, that we are living creatures whose relationship to each other are defined by those limitations in our living and our social being, and for that reason, there's something distinctive about the animation of our intelligence, something distinctive about the living character of it, the social character of it, which is not reflected in statistical token predicting systems, which is what the technology actually is.
Well, Professor Leslie, thank you so much. I would have loved to talk longer. We'll do it longer next time.
Next.